Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. Alrighty, so here we go with part 2 of our podcast here on Q&A type sessions. And on this one, we're going to cover pretty much everything related to the injuries that came in, the injury questions that came in. So this is something that I get a lot of emails and DMs and messages from, people about, my son or daughter has an injury, or someone that I coach has an injury, or we're worried about injuries. We want to prevent something like back pain or shoulder pain. And it's tough sometimes to answer these online. And it's also tough sometimes to answer these in like a really short explanation. Most of these things are pretty in-depth and complicated and have a lot of factors that go into them. And so it's better sometimes to hold these questions and do them on a podcast like this and maybe explain some ideas versus, give someone a paragraph back on a message or an email, which unfortunately sometimes is really, really challenging. So we're going to go through the same thing that we did, about 5 or so that I picked from all the ones that were submitted, and the most common ones, because the ones that I think maybe help the most people, or the ones that give a little bit more of an overarching answer, which a lot of people can take value from. So the first one here we'll start with, this comes from Josh. Josh says, many of the boys that I coach are starting to get shoulder problems. And 2 have been diagnosed with labral tears in their shoulder. What prehab exercises can I do to prevent this? And I intentionally put this one first for a couple reasons. One is because, nothing ill will intended to Josh. If you're listening, I thank you for thinking about your shoulders of the guys you coach and all that kind of stuff. But the problem here with this question is that he's saying that essentially there are boys that have pain, right? And he's looking for prehab exercises to try to prevent this. And I've seen and heard this quite a bit in the gymnastics community and many other sports as well. When really great coaches who are really well-intentioned are trying to help the athletes they work with. And unfortunately, at this point, this person has an injury. So there's not a lot of prehab stuff that you can do to make things better, right? This is an injury or a rehab situation. So you need someone who's a very good medical provider to do a full assessment and break down why they might have shoulder pain and what can be done to help out with that. Now, that being said, there's no reason why you can't work with that medical provider and take those exercises that they think are useful and give them back to your gym, to the people that are not hurt, to have a nice, well-rounded, preventative program or a prehab program like this describes. So I think I see this unfortunately a lot sometimes, when particularly with someone who has like ankle sprains, or somebody has some back pain, or somebody has some wrist pain. They just kind of look online and try to find exercises that will help the pain go away. And that's really a medical provider's job. And it's not to say medical providers are better than coaches. I don't imply that. I mean that it's complicated. There's a lot of different reasons why someone can have shoulder pain. And that can be anything from mobility to strength deficits to range of motion, or dynamic stability combinations. There can be a lot of issues that are just naturally built into like the workloads or the periodization or new skills. It could be a freak accident, but there's a lot of things that could go wrong, from labral tears to cuff tears to instability to AC joint stuff. So if you're not a medical provider and you don't understand how to tease out which one of those things it is, you could give the wrong exercises. And this is why I don't like to give online advice, because without a full hands-on assessment, I'm really doing someone a disservice if I can't get my hands on them and move their shoulder and kind of do some special tests and understand what's going on. That's really going to change what skills they probably can do or what things we should modify. So in terms of what you should do now, Josh, I would say probably the best thing is to work with a medical provider, get the exercises or mobility things figured out that would help those specific gymnasts. But I can give you some ideas about globally what creates some of these shoulder issues in men's gymnastics, and hopefully that will help, maybe prevent some of these things down the road. So the shoulder joint itself has a couple things to think about. But before we think about the actual shoulder joint, one of the biggest things to consider with any injuries, but particularly this in men's gymnastics, is the workloads, right? Or planning your skill volume, or planning your periodization. So periodization just refers to, light, medium, or heavy intensity days, and what you're going to do on each of those days to try to make sure you're not just continuously doing really, really, really hard things in the shoulder or any body part that might make it a little bit sore over time. So in men's gymnastics, the things that typically cause some of these shoulder pains are going to be the extreme ranges of motion and the very, very high force contractions. So anything that involves, like a ring giant, or a men's high bar dismount that has a Chinese tap, or a release move, or a bobzar, or a tapel, or a moi, or some more extreme ranges of motion across some of those skills. like a jam, for example, on high bar. Those are all probably considered a little bit more of the higher risk category because you're not going to get hurt when you do one. But if you do all of those types of skills in the same day or the same few days, it can add up a little bit and irritate the shoulder, right? So say one day you do a lot of long hang swings on parallel bars like giants, or long swing stuff like moys and pelts. You also do quite a bit of ring giants that day. You also do quite a bit of high bar and dismounts, high bar releases and dismounts, timers or stuff like that. The combination of all that plus maybe some ring strength, that can probably irritate the rotator cuff or some of the shoulder muscles themselves. So I would try my best to plan what days of the week you can maybe rotate those things around. Maybe work underbar work on the day that you work ring giants and high bar dismounts, or try to find a little bit of way to do a little bit more drill work on some of those stations. So it's not all just doing turn after turn after turn after turn, because you want to do those things, obviously train those skills, get the shoulder ready for it, but you might just be spiking a little bit into how much you're doing in a short period of time. And when kids are growing or they're going through puberty or stuff like that, or they're not developed yet, they might not have the shoulders to the shoulder strength to handle that kind of force. So that's one bigger thing to think about. And then on top of that, also we have to remember that the three things that shoulders really need to stay healthy are going to be mobility, strength, and dynamic stability. Those are like the three big things to think about. So mobility wise, as I just said, sometimes when you're growing, you can have some limited soft tissue flexibility of your underarms, like your lats, your teres major, and your pecs. It's very common for male gymnasts to get stiff in those areas when they're growing or they're just training a lot. So doing some soft tissue work, doing some ball rolling, doing some PVC stick stretching, doing some proper chest stretching, doing some eccentric chin-up lowers, doing some eccentric push-ups. Those things are going to be helpful to try to maintain soft tissue flexibility in the shoulder joint. And then along with that, strength and dynamic stability, obviously a full strength program is really important. So dips, handstand, push-ups, rows, feet elevated rows, face pulls. Like you just have to do really good physical preparation. But you also need to remember that the rotator cuff and the scapula itself needs that much strengthening. It needs that high intensity strengthening as well. So every guy that I work with 2 times a week, they're doing sideline dumbbell ER, they're doing prone T's, prone Y's, prone U's, standing full cans, banded external rotations at internal and external at 90. And they're doing those in a way that's very, very challenging. So maybe 2 sets of 12, somewhere between 5 to 8 pounds in the dumbbells, because we want them to hypertrophy those muscles. So it's not just like a 1 or 2 pound weight for 15 reps in endurance. It's kind of a myth in the rehab world. We want hypertrophy of these muscles so that they can stand up for the force tolerance that the traction forces put on your shoulder. Okay. And then dynamic stability, I think like handstand hold and some other stuff like that work, and some other things work really well. But I think you also need to get some general stuff in there too. So overhead dumbbell carries, Turkish get-ups, suitcase carries, reverse bear crawls. A lot of that stuff can help do some dynamic stability work as well. Teach that cuff to kind of co-contract. So long answer there, Josh, but that's something that I think a lot of people struggle with. So I wanted to make sure that people had a pretty comprehensive thing to understand there. On the next one here, very similar. I included this one on purpose because it was similar to the first one. But Amy says, my daughter is 12 years old and is starting to complain about lower back pain when she tumbles or does beam back walkovers. She's also been working a lot of Yurchenkos and back handsprings on beam for her series and thinks that is where it started. What can we do about it? So again, first line of defense, if someone is having pain, you have to get them checked out by a medical provider. Okay? Back pain in particular can have a lot of different causes, a lot of different issues. You could have just some muscular irritation. You could have some facet joint or some joint crankiness in your lower back. You could also possibly have the start of a stress reaction or a stress fracture. And if that's the case, you want to catch that really early and make sure it heals. So I would definitely get screened by a medical provider. I would definitely try to get to a doctor and get some imaging done just to make sure it's nothing too serious. But the back pain situation in female gymnasts is very similar to the male situation with shoulders. In back pain, the first thing we want to look at is we want to understand, is there something above or below the lower back that is maybe not moving enough and it's putting extra pressure on the lower back? So maybe the upper back is stiff, called a thoracic spine. It doesn't bend back as well. Maybe the shoulder, the overhead shoulder mobility, as I just talked about with a male gymnast, is also limited in a female gymnast because of growth or training or doing a lot of bars. And the limited flexibility overhead is causing some more pressure on their lower back. Maybe their hip doesn't extend all the way, doesn't go forward. So their hip flexors or their quads or their inner thighs might be stiff and not allowing them to extend their hips fully. And it's putting more pressure on their lower back. So I would look at those three things first and try to figure out, is there something that's not moving enough that's making the lower back move more? Okay. Ankle mobility is also something. Sometimes when you land in a big arch, that limited ankle flexibility can put pressure on your back. So I would screen that as well. There are other times that it's not about mobility. It's more about someone who just lacks control or strength to do a proper bridge pattern, do a proper back handspring pattern or your Chanko, and not using the right muscles to kind of activate and stay really, really tight. So I would also be checking the strength of the upper back, the scapula muscles. I would also be checking the strength of the hips, the hamstrings, and the glutes and the external rotators to try to see if the hips can be opened more with nice glute contraction or using their hamstrings and their external rotators of their hip. And then I also want to be checking out just their overall core tightness and core stiffness ability. Do they know how to create a nice, tight, rigid core and brace while still having a nice breathing pattern? And do they understand how to brace when they do a back bend or when they do a nice back handspring shape? They can't just kind of relax their core and sink into their lower back. They got to really tighten that core up and be nice and firm there. So I'd be looking at all the mobility things first, then be looking at some of the strength and control things. Then I'd be looking at technique. Do they just not understand where to put their hands or where to look or how to stay tight when they hit the board or how to do a nice tap swing without really relaxing their spine? So all of those things kind of factor into it. And just like the male gymnast, the workload is going to be really, really important, right? So in this situation, it sounds like she's doing some back handsprings or back walkovers on beam. She's learning your Chenko, so she's back bending there as well. She's probably tumbling on floor and doing some back bends, and then sometimes either doing some releases or different skills on uneven bars also puts some back bending stress on the lower back. So I'd have to, be curious about maybe talking with our coach about, again, can we find one event per day where we kind of take away the back bending and we just do something else? So maybe we do dismounts, maybe we do pirouettes, maybe we do some front tumbling, and just find one day and try to rotate in or out how much stress you're putting on the back. It's very easy to get into like the 200, 300, 400 back bends, per day or per week, if you don't think about those things proactively. So in terms of exercises that are helpful, the soft tissue mobility stuff we just talked about for the shoulder, thoracic back bends are really great over a foam roller. So just kind of leaning on your upper back and arching back and trying to get your upper back to bend backwards. Thoracic windmills laying on your side are great, which is where you lay on your side, flex one knee up and kind of turn your upper back away from the side that has your knee flexed up, and it kind of gets your upper back to loosen up. And then for your hip flexors, right, like rolling out your quads, inner thighs, hamstrings, true hip flexor stretches, doing some nice eccentric sliders to try to get the hip flexors and quads to open up for a split. Doing some rear foot elevated split squats with eccentrics are really, really great as well. And then doing some inner thigh flexibility things like half kneeling rocks to the side to get your inner thighs to stretch out, or rock backs. All those things are really, really great for glutes. I really love single leg weighted hip lifts. I like side plank clamshells. I like single leg RDLs. I like doing some lateral band walks. All those things are okay. Step ups, split squats are really good for the hamstrings and glutes as well. So I'd be adding those into a strength program. And usually it takes about 4 weeks for most of these things to show up and change flexibility. So hopefully that helps out a little bit with some of the understanding there, and you can get some help there. The next one comes from an anonymous person who submitted this. Actually, I'm not sure if they forgot their name or just didn't want to be mentioned, but it says, I'm a medical provider working in the NCAA, and Achilles injuries are, including Achilles tears, continue to be a huge problem for our team. Given your experiences and the new research projects you guys have put out, what should we be doing to help reduce this risk? So the research project comes out, or they're talking about, came out a couple months ago from when I'm recording this. But me, Dr. Ellen Casey, and a bunch of the team at HSS put together a nice survey data of current Division I through Division III college athletes, gymnasts, and we surveyed essentially, how much did you train when you were little? What skills did you do? All that kind of stuff in terms of like hours per week, events you train, the hardest skills you train during. We also asked that during college, what was the hardest skill you competed? How much do you train? What are the hours? All that kind of stuff. And then we also asked, did you tear your Achilles at all? And out of the 560 people we asked, we had 100 people who reported an Achilles tear. And what happened there is we went back and looked at the risk factors correlated, not causative, which is important, but essentially asked, like, okay, for those that did say they tore their Achilles, were there things that were common to that group versus the other group who didn't tear their Achilles? And what does that say? And so what we found in our study is that we did find that it wasn't event specialty so much, but all around training. So being an all arounder in college, and then also specializing when you're young in elite gymnastics. So doing elite gymnastics at a young age, doing really hard tumbling and vaulting skills at a young age. Those were risk factors for somebody to then So those are risk factors to be correlated with someone who said they tore their Achilles later down the road in college. So what that means is that we think that data tells us that it's maybe about how much total training they're doing and the difficulty of skills they're doing when they're young might be predisposing a little bit more risk for someone who might have an Achilles tear, report an Achilles tear later in college. And then in college, we had some things also related to all around training, the difficulty of skills they were doing on floor and vault, the amount of time they were training. And then we also had some issues related to retinoid medication use. There was also a report of people who self-reported as being African-American was also more reported of ruptures during the NCAA seasons. So with that in mind, you think about what does that mean? So when you're younger, I think there are some things we have to do. I think we have to educate coaches who have higher level gymnasts. Keep in mind that about 90% of the tears reported were on back tumbling on floor. So taking off for a double back or a double pike or a double layout or a full in or something like that, a really high intensity skill. 10%, so 10 tears were more on vault taking off on the board. So with that said, though, we have to educate coaches about these ideas and we have to teach them that, hey, when you're younger, when your athlete is doing elite gymnastics or level 10 gymnastics, you have to realize that doing a lot of high intensity hours and high intensity tumbling passes when they're young is something to be on your radar, right? So maybe we have to be careful about letting 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds train full ins or double layouts on hard surfaces when they're really, really young, because that might put some extra pressure on their Achilles. Interestingly enough, we didn't find past injuries were correlated to somebody reporting an Achilles rupture. So someone who had Sever's disease or an ankle injury, I thought that would be the case, but I was wrong. But it means that we have to be very, very aware of the total training hours and the total impact hours. We had some speculation that maybe when they're younger and they're going through puberty, the combination of the really high training hours and then also maybe a combination of possible nutrition issues or sleep or recovery issues might be impacting the health of the collagen of the Achilles tendon. When you're younger and you're not doing as much training as dense training so hard so soon, and you have your meets are spaced out, it might not be an issue. But when you get to college, right, you have much more of a dense college season. It goes all really back to back to back to back week meet weekends, and you're oftentimes doing your harder passes every week, multiple times per day to prepare for those meets. So we have to educate coaches who are with younger athletes that maybe have college prospects or college goals, that we have to be very careful about how hard we go on those, D or E tumbling passes when they're really young. And then also we found that wasn't correlated in college was BMI. So BMI was not correlated to somebody reporting an Achilles rupture, which is unfortunately a very common myth that we hear about, which is, oh, they gained 15 pounds in college, this and that, it's their weight, they tore their Achilles, which is total garbage, absolute garbage in my opinion. I don't think the data reflects that at all. But in college, I think we do have some things we can work on. So one is trying to make sure we understand the density of the college season. So maybe we have to get a better off-season and preseason training program to kind of get more strength and conditioning, get their tendons healthier, kind of work on some direct calf loading, like strength and conditioning for the calf, some plyometrics to condition their calves before preseason. So we're not just diving into really hard tumbling passes when they get back. I think we need to really consider the length and the density of the college season of how many meets we're doing and if they're back to back to back weeks. And then also think about, the 2 to 3 days back to back. If someone's doing a double dual meet on a weekend, like doing one, traveling to another college, doing one, you got to be aware of that, about how much pressure is going on someone and also what's going on with, like, can you switch your rotation out and stuff like that. And then globally, I think this is for both younger and older, we have to be much better about adopting science-based strength and conditioning. So we need to be much better about using proper weightlifting, proper periodization, exercises that are science-based, periodization models that are science-based, because that's a really great way to build protection against injury risk is doing a really great strength and conditioning program. So anywhere from, lower body split squats and deadlifts and hip lifts, but also direct calf loading. So seated calf raises, standing calf raises off a deficit, tiptoe walk, isometrics with kettlebells or dumbbells in your hands. Those things can help condition the tendon. And then also we can hopefully start to ramp somebody up with plyometrics over the course of a summer and get those tendons ready, rather than kind of not doing a lot in the summer and then kind of jumping right into it, no pun intended, when the preseason comes, even if it's basic tumbling. So I think those are all things that would help if we continue to work on it just a little bit. So hopefully, anonymous, that is a good answer to your question, and I can kind of get the ball rolling for you guys to work on that at your school. James says, I'm a PT who is working with a lot of gymnasts, and all of them seem to struggle with knee or ankle related pain during landings. What can we do as medical providers to help this out? I feel like they are, as soon as they rest and are getting better, 2 months later, they are back in my office with the same type of pain. So there are two sides of this coin that I want to talk about. So one is on the medical provider side. I think we all need to do a better job of really making sure we're doing strength and conditioning programs and plyometric and sports performance programs that are hard enough for the athlete to get conditioned to an above level of where they came into you. So if somebody comes in with an ankle sprain, or if somebody comes in with like growth plate related pain or some sort of injury, we have to be very good as medical providers about doing hard enough strength and conditioning, not just like basic exercises that you would do in the beginning, but actually progressing those to be harder and harder and harder as you get towards the end of the rehab phase. And I know this is tough with insurances. I know this is really tough with time commitments, but if nothing else, you can build them a home program that they can do at the gym, or you can work with a strength conditioning coach and give them exercises that they would need to work on, right? I find in a lot of athletes that I work with that I used to make this mistake too, is that they don't get hard enough conditioning exercises for their ankles and for their plyometrics before they start the return to sport program in gymnastics. So I always give people, like, when they're starting plyometrics, like pogo hops and scissor hops and in and out hops and single leg hops, that starts things a little bit, but they're also within a couple weeks doing step ups, split squats, hip lifts, really aggressive calf strengthening, the same stuff I just talked about, seated and standing calf raises with heavy kettlebells or dumbbells. Then we increase the plyometrics significantly. So single leg bounding over hurdles, single leg bounding down the turf, high skip jumps, really explosive depth jumps and drop jumps and vertical jumps. We do those things because we want to stress their Achilles, their ankle, their knees, their hips in the same way that's going to be coming down the road when they do basic gymnastics. Even basic gymnastics of jumping on trampolines, or stuff for basics on floor and vault and beam, or landing on dismount of high bar and P bars, they're still really, really stressful on the ankle. So we have to be better as medical providers about knowing, okay, what is the natural progression of strength and conditioning and power and plyometrics? How can we as PTs or ATs or chiros be better about using that kind of stuff? Okay. The second piece here is we have to make sure that we give very specific return to sport programs. Okay. And I made a YouTube video about this recently if you want to check it out. But in general, I try to make sure that someone understands that, hey, when you're feeling better and you're pain free, it's going to be still 4 to 6 weeks or more, depending on the injury, to slowly get back to gymnastics. Okay. And the three things that we do there are going to be impact, surface numbers, so how many times they actually hit the ground, the actual force per skill, and then actually it's going to be the number of skills they do together that are a similar category. And we'll also include the surface into that as well. And we're going to talk about this as well, right? So impact number, surface, force per skill are the three things. And it happens to be the next question, which is why I put it in here. But this is what kind of the lead up to it. So in this, right, Kara says, what is your process for getting a gymnast safely back to training? There isn't any great literature on return to sport guidelines, and it's really overwhelming to do as an athletic trainer working with gymnasts. Okay. So like I just said, we need specific return to sport programs that are going to give someone exactly what to do and is a natural progression of force over time. Okay. So force per skill, the number of impacts they take, and then the actual surface they're working on are going to be the big three things that we're going to work on. And this comes from the baseball world that I took it from, which is like they do distance of throws, how many throws per week, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So when I make these programs, I expose somebody to their program 3 times per week. And every 2 weeks, we increase the difficulty. Okay. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we try to go, maybe if it's a more intense injury, maybe 2 days per week, Monday, Thursday, to have more days in between to let things heal and recover, especially the collagen tissue and some of the soft tissue. But when we make these programs, so number one is the force per skill. Okay. Just doing basic round off back handspring back tuck on a tumble track is less stressful than doing round off back handspring double back, which is less stressful than doing round off back handspring double layout, right? You need to tumble harder to get higher in the air. It's the same thing for other skills on events, right? Like for floor, for bars, for example, on bars, basic tap swings on a strap bar are less stressful than basic tap swings on a high bar, which is less stressful than giants on a high bar, which is less stressful than a release move, which is less stressful than a Chinese tap for a double back or a double layout for a male gymnast. Okay. So you have to understand and know what skills are in order of stress. And if you're a medical provider who doesn't know gymnastics well, you have to learn from a gymnast or learn from a medical provider and learn from a gymnastics coach, work with them to build a nice natural progression of force over time. So force progression of skill is one. The number of skills they do is pretty straightforward. So the number of impacts they take, the number of swinging skills they're doing, the number of back bends they're doing, you just count those up throughout the program that you make, and you slowly increase the numbers week to week, right? We want to kind of go slowly dripping more and more volume on them to make sure it feels like it's appropriate. Okay. And the last one, the surface, is also something that can dampen some of the forces. So a tumble track is much less stress, and a trampoline is much less stress than doing something like a rod strip, right? Or doing like a tumble track with mats on top of it so it buffers it, or tumbling onto a sting mat or 8 inchers, versus that is less stressful than tumbling on the hard floor. Right. So we can use different surfaces that are either trampolines or softer resi pits to expose low levels of force. Say if someone has a wrist injury, we might do a sting pad on the beam. We might do a softer resi instead of a hard table they're vaulting onto. We might tumble on tumble track instead of doing the hard floor. That will help give us a way to expose those skills at lower force and low on that surface. Then we slowly, every 2 weeks, we change the surface. So we might go from, low impact skills the first week of basics. 2 weeks later, we might go medium force skills. Then 2 weeks later, we might go high force skills. We might go, I'm making these numbers up, 100 ground contacts per day on the first 2 weeks, 200 ground contacts the second 2 weeks, 300 ground contacts the next 2 weeks, and then open ended after that. We might do tumble track and trampoline the first 2 weeks in softer surfaces like pits or resis. Then the next 2 weeks, weeks 3 and 4, we might add some medium surfaces where they go sometimes on the hard surface, sometimes not. Use a sting mat or something like that. The last 2 weeks, we might fully get them into their hard training that they're doing the most intense stuff. Okay. So I make those programs on those 3 variables, get the athlete's skills, write down the entire program, work with their coach to figure out how many days per week they're training, how many days per week we can do what events. And then I give them a program of how many to do of each of those, right? And then within those programs, so say Monday through Friday, they're training 4 events per day. One of those events, I make a home program for gymnastics, right? So like instead of doing vault, bars, beam, floor for a female gymnast, or doing all like 4 out of 6 events for a male gymnast, I would intentionally make the home program be at the gym on one of those days so that they're not bored twiddling their thumbs, but they're also not getting a super high dose to exposure too early on. So instead of doing, 3 events, they might do 2 events in one PT home strength day with the stuff we've done for PT. Instead of 4 events, they might do 3 events for male gymnasts and have something to work on with their prehab program or their rehab program from home. Okay. And that helps kind of smooth over the transition getting into some of these things. So a little bit long answer there between questions 4 and question 5, but those are something that I get asked a ton about, and I really wanted to clarify how to go about that, because those things are really kind of universal return to sport programs, and making sure you're getting a nice progression to a high level degree of strength and conditioning before you get them back into some of the gymnastics basic stuff. So those 5 questions are really common. I hope they were really useful. If we enjoy these formats, and we'll do some more next week and the following week, I'm happy to keep doing them every once in a while if they help answer questions, because obviously the podcast only exists because we have listeners. And if more people are listening, and then when people value the questions, then we'll keep doing more and it gets more awareness to it. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this, you can let us know on social media if you like the questions or ask clarification. That's totally fine. You can jump over to the Shift Show website and just ask a question yourself if you'd like. But just rate and review on iTunes, like we said, get more awareness to the podcast. Maybe screenshot this and toss it up and let me know what your favorite question was or what you need clarification on. I'm more than happy to help. So hope this was useful. And then next week, we'll actually dive into some flexibility stuff. All right. Have a great week.